Minerva knelt beside the stove with an auger between her hands, while two neighbors stood in the doorway, telling Elias to pull back from the boards. The iron box had been breathing wrong for a week, coughing smoke each time the wind pressed down the ravine, and the cold outside was sharpening into the kind that sealed doors, stiffened water pails, and left a cabin one dead fire away from trouble. When the auger bit through the floor beside the stove leg, one woman said she was opening a winter mouth under her own feet. Minerva did not answer. She put her cheek near the ash drawer, watched the weak flame bend, and drove the tool deeper. The auger came up, carrying a tight curl of pale wood. A thread of colder air touched the hem of her skirt, and the fire, which had been sinking into a red and smoky bed, lifted for a moment and showed a cleaner orange under the soot. That was enough for her to keep working. The cabin sat low in a Missouri border ravine where the wind never behaved the same way twice. It dropped off the ridge, struck the roof, slid along the banked earth behind the house, and seemed to press smoke back down the stovepipe just when the room needed drawing most. Minerva Cole was 60, spare in build, unhurried, except when work required haste, and seasoned by enough winters to know that a fire could fail from hunger as surely as from wet wood. Elias, her grandson, was 10, narrow-shouldered and watchful, old enough to carry kindling and learn what mattered. He had been in her care since the spring. His mother was buried beyond the ridge, and his father went west with a freight outfit and never returned. There had been no room in frontier life for much talking over sorrow. The boy had simply stayed, and Minerva had made a place for him in the order of her days. The stove had burned honestly in autumn. Once the real cold set in, it turned difficult. When the door stood open, even a crack, the fire woke and pulled hard. When the door had to stay shut to save heat, the draft faltered. Fresh wood smoked instead of catching cleanly. The flame slumped low, as if the iron box had lost heart. More than once, Minerva had woken after midnight to the bitter taste of smoke and found the pipe warm, but the draw weak, the room close and sour, the coals alive, yet not alive enough. A dead fire in such weather was not an inconvenience. It was the beginning of a harder night. More wood burned, water freezing where it should not freeze, and a child waking cold. The danger already showed itself in the room. A black fan of soot had begun to spread on the wall above the stove. Frost held along the inner edge of the north window even after the morning fire was fed. The kettle took longer to move. Their wood pile, though not poor, was not deep enough for waste. Every time the door had to be opened to rescue the draft, The room lost what the stove had spent an hour building. Minerva had cleaned the pipe 2 days before. She had checked the joints, burned twists of paper, watched the smoke, watched the flame, opened the door, shut it, and opened it again. The answer came not from guessing, but from repetition. The stove drew best when the room was given more air than the shut cabin naturally spared. If the air did not come through the door, it needed a smaller road of its own, and that was when the neighbors stopped at the threshold and found her with the auger. One woman from the upper track pulled her shawl tighter and stared at the marked floor by the stove leg. Another stood behind her, already prepared to carry the story farther than the snow. Their boots darkened the sill with melt. "What are you boring there?" the first asked. "A path for air," Minerva said. "A path for winter," the second answered at once. Then, looking toward Elias, she added, "Best keep your feet off the boards if she means to let frost up under the house." Minerva did not look up. Mockery never improved a draft. She set the auger true and turned it with both hands until the bit broke through. Now, with that first breath of colder air reaching the stove, Elias saw the flame sharpen. "It rose," he said quietly. "It did," Minerva answered. The hole was too small to do the whole work, but it proved the matter. She slid the stove door open the least little way. At once the fire pulled stronger. Then she shut it again and watched the flame sag. A door left loose would spend heat faster than wood could replace it. She needed a way to feed the stove without turning the cabin into a crossing for the ravine. By toward midday, the story had already gone uphill. Before Minerva had finished marking a wider opening, a handyman from the creek road came to inspect the foolishness for himself. He liked being useful where people could see him be useful. He stood with his mittens tucked in his belt and looked at the boards as if the mistake had already been completed. "Smoke is fixed above, not below," he said. "Any fool knows that." "Then it will be simple enough to see whether this one is a fool," Minerva said. He laughed, though not kindly. "Put more holes in a cabin, and you will feed the whole winter." She gave him no more than that. The stove was the only argument worth having. She asked Elias for the scrap tin from an old lard can, then widened the opening near the stove, but not so near the leg that heat would char the edges. The cold came up honest and immediate. Elias felt it against his stockinged feet and looked at her with that quick fear children try to hide when they think a grown person may have done something wrong. "It bites," he said. "It will until it is governed." She measured the tin, cut a strip with dull shears, and shaped it into a collar so the vent would hold true, and the wood would not fray or scorch. And she bent tabs along one edge, nailed the collar in place from below after lifting a loose board, and then cut a flat slide from oak scrap. 2 thin guide strips held it so the vent could be covered almost completely, or opened in measures no wider than a finger. It was plain work, but plain work done right often saved harder work later. Elias crouched opposite her and moved the slide when she asked. Open a little. The fire sharpened. Open too much. The cold curled around their ankles, and the flame burned too eager. Closed too far, the draft weakened again. The cure was not merely a hole. It was a hole governed to the stove's need. There, Minerva said after the 7th adjustment. See the flame. It stood straighter than before, no smoke rolling from it, no lazy choking along the wood. It is not fighting, Elias said. No, it is being fed. That first evening gave her reason to hope, but not reason to boast. After dark, the wind came down the ravine and worried the outer wall. The door stayed shut to keep the room warm. Minerva sat with mending in her lap and watched the fire between stitches. Twice she moved the little peg on the slide with the toe of her shoe. Once she closed it nearly flat when the gusting eased. By bedtime, the stove still held a clean burn. The room was not hot, but warmth remained in the right places, around the iron, in the blankets warming by the chair, in the pot that did not have to wait for a half-dead fire to revive. Morning proved a little more. Before first light, Minerva stepped out for water and found ice in the bucket under the eave, though it had been emptied before sleep, and she broke fresh water at the seep with the back of the hatchet, filled the pail, and came into a room still warm enough that the dishwater in the basin had not stiffened. That mattered more than comfort. A stove kept alive through the night meant less wood spent bringing a cabin back from the edge of freezing. Their oak stack stood decent under the lean-to, but no frontier winter ever let a family feel rich in fuel. The talk, however, kept moving. A passing boy shouted from the trail that Minerva Cole had drilled a winter mouth through her own floorboards. Elias heard him while carrying in kindling and stood still after the sound had gone. They keep saying it, he said. They will tire before the weather does, Minerva replied. But what if it steals the heat, after all? She looked at the kettle lid trembling over a clean flame, and then the room will tell the truth, and they will not need to. That answer satisfied him only in part. Children liked clearer victories than weather allowed. To ease the weakness she had noticed, Minerva shaved a tighter slide when the oak scrap shrank slightly by the hearth and let a line of draught leak past. She rubbed the new piece with tallow so it would not stick, added a little peg handle that could be found in the dark, and laid flat stones near the vent so the slight chill on the floorboards would not reach so quickly into their feet. She also packed fresh clay in a crack along the far wall, because feeding air to the stove did not mean giving the whole cabin leave to leak at random. For several days, the cabin told a different story than the neighbors did. When the wind struck the roof and rolled down the bank, the pipe no longer coughed smoke back with every shift. When the door stayed shut through a meal, the fire kept hold instead of turning sullen. When Elias woke before dawn, he found a living bed of coals instead of a black iron box needing rescue. The room still demanded labor, as frontier rooms always did, but it stopped punishing them for closing the door against the cold. Then the long snap came down. The first sign of it was stillness. The afternoon before it settled, the ravine lost its loose sounds. No dripping came from the bank, no wet slide fell from branch to branch. Even the crows moved with purpose rather than noise. Minerva noticed while carrying in extra armloads of oak and one of hickory. She told Elias to fill every vessel that could hold water. She set a second kettle near the stove, banked dry ashes by the doorsill, checked the vent twice before dark, and laid the poker where a half-waking hand could find it. "How long will it hold?" Elias asked, when she spread the blanket near the chair to warm before bed. "As long as it chooses," Minerva said. "Cold like this stays until it is done teaching." The first day of it forced the door shut almost without argument. The air outside was so complete in its cold that even opening the latch to empty ashes made the room gasp. The path to the seep froze hard between trips. Smoke from distant cabins rose straight and thin, which told Minerva there was almost no moving air to help a pipe once the fire lost heart. Inside, the stove became the measure of every task. She fed it smaller splits and steadier ones, never too many at a time. Too much wood dulled the draw. Too little weakened the iron, and the vent stayed open, the width of 2 fingers, most of the morning. Then less near midday, after the pipe warmed through. Each time she changed it, she watched the flame before trusting the setting. Elias learned the signs with her. The clear color at the base when the draft was right. The lazy roll when it wanted more air. The bitter smell that warned of smoke before smoke was seen. By the second night, the strain of keeping the door shut had entered all their habits. Mittens dried on a line indoors. The wash basin could not be thrown out in a careless hurry. The chamber bucket had to be managed with 1 motion, not 3. Even scraping boots on the threshold became a matter of how much cold the room could afford. That was when the vent almost lost Elias's trust, and after midnight he woke because the tip of his nose had gone cold under the quilt, and because winter made every small sound larger. Minerva heard him stir and asked from the chair whether the fire still stood. He padded over and saw at once that the slide had crept. Whether a toe had nudged it or the guide strip had loosened a fraction in the heat, he could not tell. The opening stood wider than before. A narrow stream of chill spread across the floor. "It moved," he whispered. Minerva was beside him in a moment, one hand on his shoulder, the other on the peg. The fire was burning too fast, bright but greedy. "That is not winter coming in," she said. "That is more air than the stove asked for." She set the slide back by the width of a thumbnail. The hurry went out of the flame, and then she tightened the guide with her knife and wedged a thin shaving under the strip so it would not creep again. Elias looked from the floor to the stove. It felt like the whole ground was cold. "The whole ground is cold," she said. "The trick is not to invite more of it than the fire can turn to use." He sat by the chair a little while after that, blanket around his shoulders, watching the flame regain its steadiness. Children believed best what they saw proven. By the third day of the snap, the vent had shown what would have happened without it. Minerva tested the matter once in full by closing the slide nearly flat while leaving the door barred as it had to remain. Within minutes, the fire lost edge, and the faintest gray breath touched the seam above the stove lid. She opened the vent again. The gray vanished. The wood took cleanly. That was enough. In winter, proof had to be practical, or it was nothing. Their supplies narrowed in ordinary ways. Cornbread was stretched with broth. Salt pork was cut thinner. Coffee was saved for morning and not spent at dusk. Yet the room held. Their blankets dried. The kettle never went still. Frost stayed along the window edge instead of crawling over the bed frame. A hard cabin was one thing. A defeated one was another. On the fourth day, just before midday, someone knocked at the door in a deliberate way that spoke of need rather than visiting. Minerva lifted the bar and opened only enough to see the handyman standing there with white on his beard and his shoulders drawn up against the cold. "My stove is smoking," he said. "Only when the latch stays shut. Burns clean enough if the door is loose." Minerva looked at him a moment. Behind him, the ravine lay bright and pitiless. This was not an hour for triumph. "The room is too tight for the draw you have," she said. "That is what you reckoned here? That is what the fire reckoned." He glanced once toward the floor by her stove, and for the first time did not sneer. I had not thought to feed it from below. Most men think first of what they can see above their shoulders. He accepted that because the cold had made accepting cheaper than pride. She let him kneel by the stove and study the slide, the guide strips, the tin collar at the edge of the opening. Elias watched from the bench without speaking. "You lined it," the man said. "A tin keeps the edge true." "And the heat?" "Lost less than a dying fire would cost." That answer settled somewhere in him. He stood, thanked her in a rough manner that did not come easily, and went back into the white daylight with the pattern fixed in his mind. After he left, Elias looked toward the door a long while. "He came because yours worked," he said. "He came because cold thins pride faster than warmth does," Minerva answered. The worst night came after that. The sky had cleared, which sharpened the cold instead of easing it. Boards creaked under it. Metal seemed to draw in on itself. The door stayed barred from dark until gray light. The only outside air allowed into the room was what entered by that one small road beneath the stove, and because it came where it was needed, and the pipe kept drawing upward instead of spilling trouble back into the cabin, Minerva rose 3 times through the night to tend the fire, but each tending was small. The slide touched, 2 sticks laid, ashes shifted. Nothing desperate happened, and on the frontier, that was often the nearest thing to success. Toward dawn, Elias woke to the soft rattle of the kettle lid, not the hard boil of a fire driven too high in rescue, but the steady murmur of a stove that had lived through the dark and held its own. He came out from the blanket and stood with both hands spread to the warmth. "It stayed," he said. "It stayed," Minerva answered from the chair where she had dozed upright, with her shawl around her shoulders. The room smelled of wood smoke, only in the rightful way, and the floor by the vent was cool enough to remind them what season ruled outside, but not the lawless draft Elias had feared. The cold had been given bounds. That was all Minerva had meant to do. When the weather finally eased, it did not soften at once. First, there was only a loosening in the air near midday, enough that the door could be opened to shake ashes out farther without stripping the room. Then a branch dropped from the sycamore with a wet sound instead of a crack. By evening, a thin melt had started under the eave. News came back down the ravine faster than it had gone up. The handyman had copied the vent in his own cabin and found his stove easier for it. Another place, farther off, asked what size opening she had used. A man from the creek road came to look and went away, speaking less loudly than when he arrived. And one of the women who had first called it a winter mouth brought 2 onions and half a jar of sorghum, and said she had spoken too quick. Minerva thanked her and let the apology rest where it landed. The wall above the stove no longer grew a new ribbon of soot. That was answer enough. Elias saw all of it. He saw who now looked at the floor by the stove with curiosity instead of laughter. He saw who studied the clean flame before saying anything at all. The sting he had felt when others warned him that his grandmother was inviting frost under their feet changed slowly into a quieter thing than pride, though Minerva kept even that from swelling. "No use preening over a fix," she told him while they scraped the supper pot. "It works because the stove needs what it needs, not because people talk around it." Still, the lesson held. A mockery had arrived before proof, and respect had followed only when hardship made proof impossible to ignore. The vent became part of their daily order. Morning meant checking the coal bed, then the slide. Baking meant opening it a little more to help the stronger burn. Mild afternoons meant closing it nearly flat. Before sleep, Minerva made sure the peg handle could be found in the dark. What had first looked like damage in the floor was now simply one more tool built into the cabin itself. There were gains besides the steadier fire. Less soot settled on the kettle. Less smoke touched the rafters. Their wood stack, though still lowered by the season, stood higher than it would have if each morning had begun with a dead stove and a room to be fought back from freezing. Elias's small cough, which smoke had teased on bad mornings, faded away. Minerva said little of these things, but she counted them all. Late one evening, while rain glazed the old snow and the ravine lay quiet below the ridge, Elias sat on the hearth edge, mending a broken strap under her instruction. After a long silence, he asked the question that had plainly been walking around in him. "When they said you were wrong, did it trouble you?" Minerva drew the knife once along a willow kindling stick and set the shaving aside before answering. "It troubles anyone to be thought foolish. Then why keep on? Because the stove was in more trouble than my pride." He looked at her carefully. And if it had failed? Then she would have closed the vent, mended the board, and found another way. That satisfied him more than certainty would have. A frontier life rarely offered certainty until after the work was done. What it offered instead were signs, risks, and the need to choose before comfort could choose for you. By the next turn of weather, the phrase "winter mouth" had nearly worn itself out in the ravine. In 2 cabins along the creek road, small vents had appeared near stoves, each made a little differently according to the hand that built it. One used a square lid weighted with a pebble. Another had a flap of leather over the opening. None looked quite like Minerva's neat oak slide with its dark peg handle, but neatness was not the point. Fires stayed alive. Rooms smoked less. Doors stayed shut longer without punishing the people inside. Minerva took no pleasure in being called right. She would have found that kind of pleasure too expensive, because winter always asked the next question soon enough. There was still the north wall crack to pack again, the latch to shim, the woodshed sill to shore where melt had softened the ground. Frontier life remained what it had always been. One weakness noticed in time, another one waiting farther on. Yet the cabin carried itself differently now. Not proud, simply steadier. When another hard wind came down the ravine, after dark, Elias looked toward the stove out of habit. Minerva told him to move the slide open a little more. He did. The flame bent once, then held firm, taking the narrow road of air from below and climbing the pipe with a clean, settled purpose. "That much?" he asked. "That much for this wind?" He left it there and watched the stove go on as if the gust outside were no business of its own. The smile that touched his face was small, fitting the room. Outside, the ravine gathered dark between its banks. The trees stood bare and patient. Somewhere up the track, a dog barked once and was still. Inside, the stove held a clean flame over a bed of coals that would last until the next tending. The floorboards were cool near the vent and warmer farther out. The kettle murmured. On the wall above the stove, the old fan of soot had stopped growing and remained only as a mark of what the room had been when the fire struggled for breath. Minerva rose, set another split on the coals, and moved the slide by the width of a finger. No more. The flame answered at once. Elias saw it answer. There was the proof plain enough for any frontier winter. Not a speech, not a boast, but a cabin holding warmth through hard weather, because one quiet woman had watched closely, cut where others feared to cut, and given the fire exactly the breath it needed without yielding the room to winter at all. If this quiet frontier struggle stayed with you, please subscribe.